Welcome to Making Sense of Ourselves, a podcast about the hard work it takes to get to know ourselves. With me, as always, is my co-host, Alfi.
Hey, everyone.
On today's episode, Alfi and I are digging deep into a topic that we have very different perspectives and views on based on our worldviews and our upbringing. We'll be discussing the role that safety and risk play in personal development. Alfi is much more of a risk taker compared to me. I value safety for a variety of reasons, and the creation of safety has become a core principle in my life as the chief sense maker at the Sense Makers Club. There have been times when our peership has been challenged by this core difference, and we thought the podcast would be a good excuse to learn more about how each of us think about the other person's strength. The way that we prepared for this episode is a little different than in the past. Alfi came up with questions to ask me about risk, and I came up with questions to ask him about safety. So before we get into those questions, Alfi, can you start us off by just defining how we're thinking about safety and risk?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. So I think one of the valuable ways that we found to sort of lay the groundwork for this conversation is using some sort of analogy to contextualize the idea of risk and safety, so that we can kind of touch back on it as we're going through this discussion. And the way we can almost think about it is if you take any person and put them at a random point in the world, you could essentially assume that to be an environment that is risky, whether it is because of natural disasters, animals, or simply a lack of shelter. There are many sort of risks that face a person who is simply out there in the world. And so what we can essentially think about safety as is the process of building up a sense of walls or some kind of protective mechanism. And that's essentially what we can use to think about safety, protecting the individual from the outside environment. And we can think about risk as stepping outside of those walls again in order to sort of brave the reality of the world. And so these are kind of like the two contrasting environments, which we'll sort of harken back to as we kind of go through the discussion. And hopefully we can develop and build on this idea of risk and safety as we're going through the conversation. But very briefly, I think that's kind of where we can maybe start, and we can use some of our questions and sort of thoughts to build up on that.
Yeah. I found that metaphor that developed in us discussing leading up to this episode, and I just felt like it was a real unlock for me because it frames risk in this very productive way, as opposed to like a scary, hard way. So I really like that metaphor. Okay, should we get into our questions?
Let's do it.
Okay, so my first question for you is, safety is a feeling, not a fact, which makes it inherently a subjective quality. So for me, safety was a scarce resource during formative times. So I seek safety in many pursuits. So my question for you is, what is your relationship with safety, and what about your upbringing shaped that?
If I were to focus specifically on the formative years and like my upbringing, I think I've always had a strong sense that home is a place of safety, and everything else outside of that is dependent on the context. I think especially given the fact that my family's originally Kenyan. My eldest brother was born in Kenya, my second brother was born in Lesotho, and I was the first one of my family born here in South Africa. And so for that reason, like we kind of were like, not only were we immigrants, we were also like markedly different from a lot of the other people in South Africa who might maybe look like me. Because we didn't speak any vernacular languages. So essentially the idea of home or the idea of safety or like my people were always specifically my family, not the people that looked like me, not the people who liked the things that I liked. It was sort of specifically the nuclear family. And I think as a result of, I would say, really good parenting, we always had the sense that, regardless of how crazy things get outside there, like whether that is school, whether it's, other aspects of your personal life, there's always a space that you can kind of like come back to and sort of find, that sense of safety. Now, on the flip side, and one of the things that has sort of shaped my idea of how real safety is, growing up, I had an illness. So like, not to get into too much detail, but I would have epileptic seizures, and the cause and triggers were never like until today. We don't really know what caused it. It kind of started at a specific point in my life, went on for years and years and years, and then it stopped around the end of high school. And so in some sense, I also always had this underlying understanding that like safety is a very, very thin veneer. And it can be shattered by different things at any point in time. And so I would say that there was also a little bit of I don't know if I'm using the right word here, but like callousness that I had to develop around that idea that even in a space that seems safe, that can change on a dime. And so, yeah, maybe we might go a little bit deeper into this as we go, but sort of that, like, understanding that helped me to see that one, like, it's easy to let fear rule your life, especially if you get transfixed on trying to find safety, you can forget to live your life. And I think I fell into that trap for a significant time in my early years. And so that's kind of like an understanding that I've sort of brought forward with me since then. So I'd say in some way, I'm extremely fortunate because of the parents and like how much work my parents put into developing a space that is positive for raising children. But then at the same time, I'd also say, I was definitely dealt my own cards from a health perspective of having to deal with the fact that safety is not guaranteed at any point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's my experience with safety.
Wow. I'm really glad that we didn't know the questions ahead of time now. I feel like it's so much, it's so much more interesting. I just realized that, like, perhaps one of the places where that tension is between the core differences of us is that because safety was not a natural resource for me, it feels like magic. And you pointing out that it's a thin veil that's easily pierced by reality or things outside of our control. Ooh, ouch. So I'm like, man, I think that that's actually like really keying in on a part of this, like why does it get so like frictionful when we talk about these two concepts? And like, I think I do have like a real Pollyanna view on what safety is and like exactly what it can do.
Well, look, one of the things that I will say about that I'll maybe qualify what I'm saying with this. I don't think the majority of people will need to think about safety like that, because I think there is a fair group of people who don't have that veil pierced in such a way so early. And so they don't need to come to terms with that for a long time. And I also realize that there is an aspect of that is somewhat unhealthy, kind of having that kind of it's not guaranteed, like, don't fool yourself sort of situation. It's sort of like the disillusioned kind of perspective on it. And I don't think it is entirely a good thing. Because
man, I'm not saying I want to be your perspective on this. I have a hard time understanding your perspective of this. Like, to me, I'm like, more safety, always good. And I don't know. I'm hoping that, and already, honestly, like one question into this, I already feel like I understand this a lot more. And I'm glad that we did the like leading up. We talked very deeply, but generally about these things. And now we're talking about us in relationship to these things. And I'm really yeah, I'm grateful for this. I think this is important. So,
Definitely.
and I have
I have to
also
say,
I've vamped enough. You can ask your first question anytime. I'm ready. Let's do it. I'm ready.
look, I think I'm gonna ease into things a little bit, because I think I've kind of gone a little bit more general and then focused in on personal questions a little bit later down the list for me. So I think one of the interesting ones that I'd be interested to hear from you, especially because I think too often, especially when it comes to the conversations about safe spaces, we don't make this distinction. And so one of my first questions for you is, how do you distinguish between a protected space and a safe space? And maybe more specifically, how do they differ in terms of their intention, or the measures of control around them, or their approach to freedom in general?
So a protected space would be like a national park where you're not allowed to disturb the place, but a safe space is a place that is about the protection of the occupants. Like if you go to that place, you will be in safety. I think that that's the difference that I see between them, like definitionally. I think that it's really interesting to think about like what is our responsibility to individuals within a place versus what is our responsibility to the place itself. Like, especially when you apply that to something like the Sense Makers Club, which is fully digital. Like, what is a place? Even at that point, is a place a website? Is a place every time we all dial into the same video call? Like, when is the place part? And I feel like there is a certain point where we do have to protect the collective environment, and there's certain things that you can put into place to protect that collective environment. Like, one thing that I'm thinking about is our orientation is like a required thing before you get access to the community. And it's introducing friction that definitely from a design perspective has the introduction of drop off and all sorts of other kind of trade-ins. But overall, it's protecting that space from having people learning what's going on while moving through that place and potentially doing harm while they're learning those lessons. Once you get inside of the club itself, I like to think about it as being a safe space in that we have rules that govern the way that we treat each other. So it's less about the collective and it's more about how we interact with one another one-on-one. It's about, understanding, asking for and adhering to people's pronouns, learning over time how to pronounce people's names correctly, figuring out like what the right level of letting people go on a little tyrant thing for 3 minutes or 4 minutes versus like cutting them off. Like things about how we interact with the individual, I think comes more into mind with safe spaces than protected ones. Yeah. How do you think about a protected space? I honestly, like, protected space is not something I've thought a lot about, just because I only think about it in terms of land.
Fair. I think one of the reasons this was sort of where I wanted to start and almost not dive straight into the question of risk and so on is because in my mind, one of the things that distinguishes it, because that distinguishes the two, is that protection, if we first take it from the actual terminology, is about preventing harm or danger. Like it doesn't leave room for that. Safety, on the other hand, leaves room for those things to a degree. It's like a safe space, you can make a mistake and the mistake is managed. A protected space, mistakes are not accepted.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean that's true. Like if you take a rock from a national park, for example, here in the US, like
they're not going to let you back.
Yeah, that's not okay. We don't do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so if I then relate that to the club, and one of the things I think that is important about the club is like when a person makes a mistake, you aren't kicked out of the club immediately. The idea is when a person is intentionally crossing a boundary and knowingly doing so, then they are a problem, and then they obviously need to be dealt with. But I think that distinction is so important, especially in the modern day, when we look at what happens on social media and the whole cancel culture that has come along with that. There is an unforgivingness that can sort of creep into what are typically called safe spaces, that I think is important to be aware of. And I would say the distinction between the safe and the protected space is essentially in how you treat the person that crosses the line.
Yeah, interesting. I like that. I like that distinction. Like, it is safe to fail. It's a safe enough space to fail. Yeah. I recently, someone, I don't remember who it was, and I apologize for that, but someone on LinkedIn said something in response to something I wrote about how we have to make it safe enough to leave. And I've been thinking a lot about that. Like, just the idea that there are a lot of systems that are built up to be safe spaces, but if they are not safe enough to depart from without loss of status or access or what have you, how safe is that really to leave? And I've been thinking a lot about that. What is the sunsetting strategy, and how do we make that safe to approach as well? That's a great first question. Thank you. It feels like safety is never equally distributed. For example, there was a meme about whether someone would rather be in the woods with an unknown man or an unknown bear. And you and I, at the time, had a very deep chat, and I want to revisit it in this discussion about safety, especially about how safety is unequally distributed. So I know that you would pick man in the scenario, and you know that I would pick bear. But my question is, I'm wondering, as a thought exercise, what would you have to know about the man to make you feel unsafe enough to pick the bear? Nothing? There's nothing I could tell you about that man that would make you pick the bear? Like, what if I told you that he is a homicidal lunatic with a machete? Do you pick the bear then?
That kind of just sounds like a small bear to me. Like,
Oh my God.
it's a bear that's weaker.
We're so different. I can't. Oh my God.
Look, there are two aspects to this, because I have since our last, because I mean, an aspect when you and I first heard about chatted about this, I somehow had been living under a rock and had never come across the meme before, and so I've since spent a little bit more time thinking about it. And I think one of the aspects which I've sort of come to realize a little bit more about is, let me put it this way. When I think about that question, the thing that I first think about is what challenge am I facing, not what are the consequences of being overpowered, for example. That's not where my mind goes first. And for example, with the bear, is like, I know that I am found, I am like, that's it. You're done. With the person, I don't think that is necessarily the case. There are plenty of people who can overpower me, and there are plenty of people who I can overpower. So it's, in some sense, that is somewhat of a toss of the coin. Now, I think the next question is about, what do you believe you can recover from? That is the next question. And I think there are few things the average person could do to me that I do not think I could recover from. Now, if the person is intentionally malicious, that to me doesn't seem like they are a random person. that is not the average, which I think is kind of why.
Well, it's not saying the average man or the average bear. It's saying an unknown man for an unknown bear. Like, you don't get to know any other information than man or bear. I think that's like, I've thought about the other side of this question, which is, what would I need to know about the man to pick man over bear, right? Like, how many things would you have to tell me about him? And ultimately, I think it probably comes down to, like, I would need someone to vouch for him. Like, I would need you to be like, oh, it's my friend that's in the woods. Or like, oh, yeah, that guy in the woods. Oh, I met him last Tuesday. He's cool. Like, I would have to have social proof that the man in the woods was all right in order to not pick the bear. Which it's interesting because like the only thing, I don't know that it's about size in this case, you know, like obviously like we have a size difference and men and women, I guess on average do maybe. But I wonder, like, is it the introduction of sexual violence that makes this question so likely for women to answer bear? Like, because that you say like things that you can recover from. And like, yeah, I think sexual violence is a thing you can never recover from. And you're right.
I don't think you'll be the same.
I think we can live with it, but I don't think you're ever the same.
Yeah, no, agreed. But I'm not at all saying that you will be the same. But I do think it is something that you can't recover from. Especially
I guess
given the fact that there are people.
You know, I guess my point is like a hatchet wound. We can all agree when it is recovered. Like we can agree that that wound has closed and is now a scar, right? But with sexual violence, you don't have, and with any kind of like emotional violence either. Like none of that can be qualified in that same way about like when are we healed, when are we recovered from it. So
and look, I think that's like I can't answer this on anybody else's behalf, and I am also only talking about this in a very hypothetical way.
Sure,
but
it's a hypothetical question. Yeah,
from the perspective of like I don't know how I would actually behave if I like, you know, if something were to happen to me from a sexual violence perspective. But I think one of the reasons why I kind of like consider it to be something that can be recovered from is because people recover from trauma, and from more intense trauma than a single sexual violent experience. And they have. Not that it was easy, not that it is simple or kind of something that you'd just be able to brush off. And I don't at all want to make little of it. I think I just have got I believe in people's resilience, and people have managed to come out of things that are hard to even imagine, and have come out stronger people. Maybe not better off, but definitely stronger people. And then maybe on the flip side of things, I think it also kind of an element that plays into this is our conceptualization of a stranger. I just have never really been afraid of strangers. Like that's kind of isn't how I think about strangers. Like I believe that I can make at least a casual acquaintance with pretty much anyone who doesn't have active malicious intentions towards me. Even with a person who is somewhat unhinged, like I think I am both capable and careful enough to navigate that, and in a way that I would say the average person might not be able to be, and so I just don't see it as threateningly as I would say
right
others might.
So like when you're thinking about the man versus the bear, you're literally thinking, if I was attacked by a man or a bear, which one is more likely to kill me? The bear.
No, not exactly, because the attack for me is already a couple of steps down the line of the interaction. It's like I can't reason with a bear. It's like with the bear, it goes directly like either you're leaving me alone or you're eating me. I do not play a factor in this equation. But with a person, I think
I
there
can
is
manipulate a bear. Like I think I could probably manipulate a bear.
No. I've watched enough bear attacks to understand that I'm just not.
No.
I'm just.
I mean,
not.
that's the thing about it that I think is really like the key to why this particular question caught fire with the internet is because it's not like women are saying that choosing the bear is a safe thing to do. Like, we're not. We're saying that the uncertainty of man is so great that the certainty of death from a bear is more palatable. And that's hard to admit because, yeah, it puts a real focus on the difference between how we feel with strangers. Like, I don't feel like I could manipulate most strangers. I think I could in a vacuum, but the reality is that I've grown up in a world where too many strangers are trying to take advantage of people like me. So I've just been taught that I need to very much avoid that. Like, yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think, like, from a social psychology and like a being able to empathize with strangers, I think that you and I have a similar skill set in that, but I don't feel like I can use that with most people. Like, do I think I could use that with most women? Maybe. Yeah, more. I'd be more likely to, for sure. But yeah, I think that there's some inherent things about that difference. That's just, it's hard. It's like a hard tension to hold.
Okay. I realize that this could very easily become a rabbit hole that we go down, but I'd maybe add two more things to this. So the first thing that I would say is the one thing that I am somewhat skeptical about with the general answers to this question is I get the sense that there is a group of people answering this question who are answering it in order to communicate their disposition towards a stranger rather than actually thinking about the question. And the reason that I say that is because there aren't very many people living in the woods. And there are many people who are answering that question who meet a strange person on a daily basis and are not acting in accordance with what they're saying. Like
what's the difference between being on a city?
People very often, like in society, and we kind of don't, and sometimes even one-on-one where there is no one watching, you know.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I'm like, if we change the question to be, if we change the question to be, there's an unknown man or an unknown bear on a city street, which would you choose? Like, that changes a lot about the context for me. Like, I would probably choose the man in that particular context because it's not the isolation of the woods. Like, part of the setup is about the isolation of the woods. It's about what men might do when they could get away with it because it's in isolation from other people versus on a city street. A bear on a city street is going to be way more destructive versus a man on a city street. Like, I can pretty much say that there's going to be other people. I'm going to be able to yell a couple blocks down. Somebody's going to hear me. Like, I can make a lot more effort to get into one of the buildings or to, you know what I mean? Like, there's just, we're not alone in a city street. So yeah, I think the context really does matter. It's part of it. Yeah. So it's not just about strangers because, like, I'm fine walking by a stranger, even like on a path in a park. But at what point does the anonymity of the space become like a red flag for me as a person who occupies the space? I don't know. I don't know how big that park has to get. I don't know how many trees need to be on that path before it feels like the woods. But there is a moment. I can tell you that I think most women know that there's that moment. It's the moment where we put the keys in our knuckles when we're walking to the car or walking to our apartment. Like, it's that moment where you just get kind of like the shivers of like, something's not safe right now. And I don't know. I don't know how much isolation would need to be introduced before I'd feel like that. Not much, to be honest. Not much. Yeah.
Now, again, this is obviously me projecting my own experiences into a situation that I wouldn't, that isn't necessarily the same to a lot of the women that might be answering that question. So I can't say I exactly know that they're not really thinking about the question. That's kind of just the sense that I get. But one of the sort of follow-ups to that, which I think we kind of ended our last conversation on, and is like, what does that perspective say about the state of our society, that we are more willing to face nearly certain death than a random stranger in an isolated place? I think in some sense there's something to be said about the deterioration of society in relation to that. But then there was something that kind of ties back to the first question that you asked me about, like the kind of...
Wait, can I stop you right there real quick? Because I want to challenge what you just said, like the deterioration of society. So to me, that would mean that it used to be different, right? Like you could have asked this question in the past and a different answer would have been answered. And I'm not saying that that's not true. I think it probably is, but I would be interested to know when the deterioration is, because I would argue that it has been probably hundreds, if not thousands of years since women started answering bear to that metaphorical question. I don't think that that's tens of years. I don't think that's the last few years. I think that that's potentially thousands of years of the deterioration of what it means to be male in the eyes of a female.
Look, I can't say that I know that answer for sure, because like the way people answer this question is still is baffling to me today.
I know it shocked you. I remember this was one of the most difficult conversations we had in the last, I don't know, 6 months or so.
Okay. Yeah. Like when I say the deterioration of society, I don't think I am saying that. I think an aspect of it, and a significant aspect of it, is that the community has grown so much that the person next door is a stranger. I think that's a problem. And that is one of the aspects of deterioration that I'm talking about. I think it's less about like the questions of morality or what good and evil. Like I don't even think that's really the relevant question. It is that the average person seems dangerous.
Well, our access to strangers is unprecedented, right? We've never had access to this many strangers. And now we have access to so many strangers. Like, I agree with you that like it probably has been a deterioration over time about scale, but I think it's scaling the same problem. Like it's just the scaled reflection of the problem. I think the misbehavior of men is the problem, and this is the scaled version of it because it hasn't been dealt with. And if it's not dealt with, it's going to grow and fester and get worse, and there'll be memes about it. And that's, but that's how you get people to talk about it. I mean, the fact that we're talking about it means something, right? Like, I don't know if anybody's listening to this, but if they are, like, the fact that we're talking about this and that people might talk about this with their family members. Like, I remember telling you after we talked about it to ask people in your life the question and see what happened. And yeah, I did the same. And it was really surprising to me. You didn't have to tell people, they didn't have to know about the meme to pick bear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe before we move on, the sort of last point I think that I would touch on this is like kind of, so I mentioned the fact that we obviously were immigrants living in South Africa. So one of the aspects, I guess, that is not unique, but I guess somewhat different is like South Africa had a significant period of xenophobia in South Africa, and so like being a foreigner in this country and even up to now in specific places is an imminent threat. And so the question of a strange person who you cannot communicate with is not unfamiliar to me. Like that is a thing that I've had to navigate. And I mean, anybody who knows even a little bit about South Africa is aware of its infamy when it comes to crime and its crime rate. And so, being practically familiar with a strange person trying to do harm to you is not out of this world. Like a lot of the people I know have been victims of some or other crime. And like not like once or twice, like it happens, And so I think there is something that is practically familiar about it that makes it realer in a certain way, which maybe makes it a little bit more scary, but also a little bit less scary because it doesn't seem out of the realm of reason. It's like, this is a question you have practically had to ask yourself before. And so in some sense, I think there is an aspect of surreal terror that can come with this if it hasn't been experienced in a practical way. So yeah, I mean that maybe is my final thought on the matter.
Yeah, no, I'm very curious to know if there's like a neighborhood or an area in South Africa where you'd pick the bear. Like I already said, on a city street, I'm gonna pick the man. But
Well,
like, if let's turn it around on you, like we put it in like one of the places that you're talking about where threat is imminent from other men. Is that a case where you pick the bear, or do you still pick the man?
No,
You still
because
pick the
I
man.
still like I've got a conceptualization of what the risk is with a dangerous person or man, like, and that it is something that can
You
be.
just said it. You just said what I don't.
It's like
I don't have
the risk is
that.
not uncertain.
The risk is uncertain. That is the fundamental difference here between us. Is that to me the risk is uncertain with man, as uncertain as with bear. And for you, there is more certainty with man than with bear.
And bear, like
Well,
the one is certain death, and the other one is maybe.
Honestly, for what it's worth, I think we're learning that Alfi is like really afraid of bears. Like, honestly, I'm kind of like, Alfi, you know that bears are not going to mess with you unless you provoke them, right? Like, you can literally go like this and get away from a bear by being big and scaring them. Like, they're very docile. They're not.
I don't
You have
want
to like
to be
take their
the one
baby
to
or
prove
something.
that.
You'd have to take their baby or their picnic basket or something to get them to hurt you. So. Anyways,
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think we can.
Yeah, let's move on off of man versus bear.
Let's take this forward.
Although, listeners, we want to hear from you, man or bear. I'm very interested to know what other people think. So, write to us, tell us.
Definitely. So here is my next question. So the next question that I have is focused a little bit more on confidence. And the question that I have is, I have found that a lot of my own personal confidence has come from being in situations of extreme risk and sometimes danger and coming out of them metaphorically in one piece. And so the question that I have is, can we develop our confidence in safe spaces without that risk? Do you think we can? And maybe, because that's maybe like a little bit not exactly the most open-ended question, maybe a follow-up to that might be, what role do you think that safety and confidence, like what is the relationship between those two?
Oh, I'm glad you asked this. I feel like there might be a misnomer that with too much safety, people might lack the confidence to be brave. And I think from my perspective, like, I've had to be brave from the beginning. And the confidence part came over time, but the confidence part always came with safety. Like, the introduction of safety resulted in an increase in my confidence. And I don't know that that is the case for people that come from a basis of safety and not having to be brave so soon. But yeah, that's been like, if I think about, for example, my career, like I would say my confidence in myself has always been tied to a person, generally an elder, that has recognized something in me and like seen me and then highlighted the thing they see. And then that boosts my confidence. And like, I feel like there's like a list of people that like every few years from the early teen all the way until present day of like this pattern of when the safety of someone seeing me for who I am or who I want to be, when the safety of someone like loving me enough to want to invest in my growth, like that's what builds my confidence. And like when I think about the club, for example, with safety, like the reason that safe spaces are so important is because it is very easy to lack confidence in yourself if you are only ever in unsafe spaces where you can be yourself. So like, for example, if you have only ever been to conferences that do not have codes of conduct and do not care about personal preferences about accessibility or are really unkind in the way that they speak about or to people in their staff, like all those things are things that like, if you haven't experienced the opposite of that, your confidence to step up in a situation like that, to be a voice that speaks in a situation like that, or heaven forbid, somebody who brings content into an environment like that, like your confidence just has to be so much higher. So I feel like the introduction of safe spaces from a community of practice standpoint has been so important for new voices to feel confidence, to be able to step up. And like, I think that safety is what allows those people to then take risks. Like the safety of the IA community during my mid-20s allowed me to take the risk of becoming a self-published author, right? Like I couldn't have done that if I didn't have the confidence that safety had provided for me. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I do realize that I guess I see my source of confidence to be somewhat different. And I think that's kind of what I'm learning from what you're describing. Because when you're talking about specific people sort of seeing you and recognizing you for who you are and what you're able to do, and that building a sense of confidence, I find that makes me question it more than feel it. Yeah. Because it's like when somebody else is recognizing something in me and they're saying that, you did this very well, or like, this is a positive thing, it's sort of like there's always a little bit of a voice in the back of my mind that's like, yes, they're saying that I am distinct from the people that they have encountered. It's like there is a context of them that kind of makes it like, yes, that's true, but you're basing that on, it's limited to the scope of things that person has experienced.
Like their bar is so low that they don't have an opinion on it?
Well, not just low, it isn't calibrated to me. It's like it's calibrated to the general person and what they think of the general person.
What about when somebody is comparing you to yourself? Like, what about when somebody's like, hey, that time that you gave that thing, like, it was better than the last time. Like, good job. Like, is that the kind of thing you believe? Or is that like the same?
If I agree with what they are pointing out, yes. But in some sense, then it's not actually about them having pointed it out.
Oh, my
It's
goodness.
that I agree with it.
Man.
And so, like, I would say my confidence in some sense is built from proof. It's like, can you go into the uncertainty and come out on the other side? Like that, if the answer to that is yes, you have got reason to be confident about the question. If the answer to that is no, it's like, that's a veneer.
And mine is like, do I have enough safety to be confident in taking a risk right now? which I realize is like probably one of the things adding to meh results, because that's not that's not a that's not a positive thing. Like that's definitely a blocker, I would say. Like when I put it that way, I'm like, ooh, I don't like the way that feels to say, but it does feel kind of true. It does. I feel like I do need a tremendous amount of safety from other people to feel confident to take any form of risk.
Well, not entirely, because I think risk, like many of the aspects of that is sort of mediated by personality, is one of those things that is so unpredictable that you need people who feel differently about it in order to be able to clearly distinguish between the times that it is worth investing in and the times that it is not. And that mediation is achieved through people that are different, talking and collaborating through it.
Yeah.
Because I realize that my perspective about risk has gotten me into some situations that are not entirely advisable.
I'm feeling the same way about safety. Like I hope that our listeners are picking up what we're putting down. Of like, I am really thrown for a loop for what I just said about myself, but simultaneously, I'm not like wishing to be in Alfi's position. Like I see a lot of danger in what you just outlined in terms of the long-term implications. Like if I was going to pop off my mouth about it, I'd be like, man, we're making a real good case for like, it doesn't matter how you grow up. Like it's all just a friggin' throw it up and see what happens. Cause yeah, I feel like either one becomes, we started this conversation talking about how we were going to be discussing the other one's strength. And I feel like what we've identified is that this probably goes into the overvalued category of our things. Like I think I overvalue safety and you might overvalue risk.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
And, it's like it's one of the things I recognize about myself, and one of the reasons why I typically get along with people who are somewhat risk averse, or let me not rather say we work well together. It takes
people who are risk
effort
averse, like me,
because true, and like a lot of the people that I've collaborated with, worked with, friends that I've had are similar in that way. I've found putting two people who are two risk-prone people together are a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I think there's been some really great, very exciting movies and books that are written about those couples. Spoiler alert, it does not end well. They like go off of cliffs and
end up blowing something up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I recently told you that I feel like a dangerous woman slinging all this safety around in a world where unsafe spaces are the norm. Is a safe space run earnestly an act of rebellion, or am I just a witch?
Okay, I don't exactly know what to do with the witch part, but
yeah, you can ignore that one. That was just for fun. That's a throwback.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, I would say that this is a difficult question to answer succinctly, because I feel as though there are a couple of moving parts that need to be pinned down in order to answer it properly. So the first thing I would say is the whole question of what exactly it means to create a safe space, and one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to clarify the distinction between a safe and protected space at the beginning of this. I would say that creating a truly and genuinely safe space is one of those things that it is so difficult that it is heroic to achieve. I think of it on the same level as trying to, be a peace negotiator, being a journalist in a war zone. It's like, that is the level of difficulty of the challenge that you're taking on if you try to create a genuinely safe space. And also one of the reasons why I think so many safe spaces eventually become harmful, because it is so difficult to do. because often when people talk about building a safe space, what they end up doing is building a space that excludes everyone apart from their in-group. And then that becomes an echo chamber, which is not a safe space, because I think the thing we talked about like developing a space in which it is acceptable to make a mistake under certain conditions of obviously like non-malicious intention. Doing that is extremely difficult because it requires you to mediate and navigate through the safety requirements of diverse people and the freedom and their freedoms. And at times, those two things will clash. And you need to be able to navigate through them clashing. And, you know, we don't have to get into details, but I get the sense that you go through that very often, some of which I hear about and some of which I know I don't. And so I think it is a serious and difficult thing to do. And as I mentioned, it is a heroic thing to do. I would also say that it is important to know that you are taking on a mammoth task in doing that. So that is how I think. I don't know whether I entirely answered the question, but that is how I see it. Especially because of how difficult, especially because I can appreciate how difficult it is to navigate different and conflicting personalities. Like, I think that to me is one of the things that makes this so important and so necessary. You know, I think as a person sort of sitting outside America looking in, I think it's one of the things that really distinguishes America in some way from a lot of other places, is that America is many different, essentially different countries calling themselves one. You know, the whole United States thing is sort of like these were disparate groups at a time who have made themselves one along the way. And the only way to achieve that is to develop a space where it is accepted that you are different and that it is accepted that you are one as well. And the only way to do that is to create a space in which it is not only accepted, but encouraged to both be yourself, but at the same time, focus more on what brings you together. And I would say we have focused as a society now, broadening it beyond simply America, we have focused a little bit too much on being ourselves and not enough on what brings us together. And it's why I think there has been so much discord. And, you know, maybe a part of that also is just social media showing the darker sides of humanity. But I think a significant aspect of the discord that we see on a day-to-day basis is that a lot of people have forgotten what makes us one or what unites us. And creating a safe space requires you to unflinchingly have your eye on what unites people rather than what distinguishes them, while still paying heed to what distinguishes them.
Yeah, no, I mean, that you hit the nail on the head in terms of what the difficulty is. It's also like, it comes back to the very first question about how safety is subjective. Like, I have to, in deciding to make a safe space, I have to be very specific about whom it is safe for, because you can't make a space that's safe for everyone, at least not one that feels that way. You could try, but it ends up being, especially to your point, in a currently divided political climate. Yeah, even the creation of a safe space in America is a declaration of who you're voting for, which is interesting. Like, I don't like that feels so true coming out of my mouth. But okay, so we've determined I am not a witch, but that I am a dangerous woman who is slinging safety around in a world where unsafe spaces are the norm. So thank you for your service as a friend to me as I go through that, because it has not been easier. That there have been some pushback on whom it should be safe for. And yeah, I feel very confident in who I've decided to prioritize.
Yeah, and I think in some sense that is the primary thing is being aware of the fact, or being aware of the lines that you are drawing of who is in and who isn't. Because I think that the danger really comes in when you try to convince yourself that everybody is included, but then at the same time you're also trying to create a space that is safe, because then you can't have both of those.
Yeah, exactly. As you know, I have received feedback on what we are making in terms of safety for the Sense Makers Club. And one camp of folks is super grateful for the rules that we have in place, while there is a vocal minority who worry that we are hindering community with too much rigor. So my question is there such a feeling as, quote, too safe? And when can emphasis on safety become a barrier to new experiences or personal growth? Like, how do you recognize when safety is holding you back?
Yeah, I think this is a really important thing to consider for anybody who is centered on this idea of building a space that is safe. And now this is my own perspective on the question, but in my mind, safety is a temporary measure. It is not a trying to make it perpetual for an individual is a mistake. And, you know, those are sort of aspects which we touched on in sort of preparing for this conversation, that a place of safety is a place where you are regenerating or healing. Right. That is one of the benefits of safety. But like any injury or wound, there is a point in which it needs to be covered and protected. And then there is a point of transition in which it needs to be stretched and like challenged, whether that is being on crutches and then eventually needing to go to physio where you're working that muscle. It's like there comes a point in which protecting is harmful to the development of the individual. And so, you know, there are essentially what we need to look out for is, are we protecting a person from something that is dangerous and harmful, or are we trying to prevent them from experiencing something scary? Because I think that everything that is dangerous is scary, but not everything that is scary is dangerous. And if we cannot distinguish between the two, we eventually steal people's opportunity for growth. You know, there's this idea in psychology which has sort of sat with me for a very long time. But it's sort of like the adage that, like, as a psychologist, you don't want to steal your client's problems. You don't want to solve their problems for them, because those things can be what builds them into the person that can face those problems. And so this, in some sense, is how I think about the question. It's like, you want to develop a place that is safe enough that a person feels like there's something to come back to when they're overwhelmed and when they're vulnerable, with the intention that you eventually want to set them out into the world again. Yeah. And, you know, if we think back to our initial metaphor, it's like you create the walls in order to develop a space that is safe and controlled, but specifically with the intention and understanding that they will then go out into the world again. And so I think that's kind of how I sort of see the issue. But I guess it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how you think about the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, this idea of something being too safe has been kind of haunting me for months. Like, I feel like it's just like this conversation, as well as the ones that we had leading up to this, have really helped to sort of color in the lines about what safety actually means in context. And like, one of the most important things about that has been the definition of what the opposite is. Like, we talked about the word danger at one point being the opposite of safety. And we ultimately landed on risk because we felt like that was more truthy, felt more realistic to what was actually the opposite of feeling safe. And I think like, yeah, my thought on it is continuing to evolve because I think like there is some aspect, like I was saying before, about how safety can be the way that some people gather their confidence to take big leaps. But like, if you only ever gather up that safety and you never actually take that leap, like, is the safety holding you back? Probably. But is that the thing that's holding you back? I don't know. So yeah, I think that like the idea of safety towards an end, I think is a really important takeaway for me. Of like safety from what and towards what end? Like safety from unsafe educational spaces in sense making, like for the purpose of showing people that it's possible, like modeling that this is possible. But like, I can't fix their world. I can't do much other than model what's possible. So, yeah.
No, definitely. And, you know, I think as you're speaking, one of the things that also kind of became clear to me is like, if the space that you're creating is safe, it implies that there is a time for the person to leave.
Yeah,
like
exactly. The safety to leave.
Now
exactly.
it is time to go.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. And that, yes, they've gathered their confidence. Now, what is the leap? And like, you know, from a community perspective, I want to be able to support them in the leap. So I think like the safe space can become the place that they can return to as they're making the leaps. Like, I think that that's one of the biggest values of the club is like this portable network that's not tied to what you're currently doing, that can continue to grow and change as you do. But yeah.
Well, so the next question I have, I think we've already somewhat touched on it, but I think it would be good for you to speak about. But the question I have is like in the context of, especially from a practical perspective, as someone who has built this kind of space, which is an aspect of safety for a lot of people, is like, how do you go about encouraging risk taking when you are the source of safety? Because I think there's always this tension of like, when people see you as the source of safety, it is hard to hear from that person that you need to leave the safety, especially because you are the representation of it. And so I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts about that.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad that you asked that, because I think like from a safety standpoint, setting up the way that people are introduced to the club and the way that our meetings run, instilling that sense of safety and how we've thought about this space as a safe space, like that part I feel is the part of my job that is more passive and reactive. So it's like, it's something that is continually being done. And occasionally there are things that step outside of that. That's like, okay, we need to tighten that up. But I feel like a larger part of my job now, like 6 months in, we're almost 7 months in now, is like seeing people, which I think the reason it's taking me back in terms of my reaction to my own answer is like, that's exactly what I told you I needed to grow confident to make those leaps. And I feel like more and more my job is that. Like, my job is reaching out to people and saying like, I see this in you and we have these tools to help you develop that thing. And so, yeah, I feel like when I think about the work that I do, mentoring with Make Sense speakers, or the work I'm doing constantly behind the scenes with members being like, hey, I heard you talked about this in a meeting. How about doing a spin-off event on that thing? Or encouraging, most recently, we launched these flex sessions where members can book their own time to present or discuss things with the community. And so like reaching out to people and being like, hey, you have a really cool topic. Why don't you actually submit? So I feel like stirring the pot has become a really big part of my role, as opposed to being the person that they see as the safety warden. Like I feel as if something unsafe happens, I absolutely will be hopefully the first person that they turn to. But I also am hopeful that I'm not seen as a person that like walks in the room and everybody tightens up how they're behaving. Like I haven't felt that myself, but honestly, like how would I have if no one has told me? So yeah, no, if anybody is feeling like that happens when I walk in the room, I would really love to hear about it. Cause yeah, I feel like more my role is recognizing everyone in the community's unique talents and aspirations, and then trying to help them to reach those things over time by building their confidence in themselves, but also in themselves within the network that we're creating here. Like we have somebody later today who's giving something that's pretty close to their first talk publicly. And, you know, that's a big milestone for that person. And they told me that the reason that they haven't done it is because they haven't felt like there was a safe enough space for it. Like they just haven't felt like stepping up. And the fact that they decided to do that here means a whole lot to me. But it also took me being like, hey, you have this thing that you have to say. And like, what if we did this here? So I think that invitation of like seeing people, that's like part of what I see as my role. Yeah. And I think that does create a sense of safety as well. Like that all of this is not going into the ether. Like, I don't know, someone is paying attention to what everybody wants around here and what they're currently doing and who they're connecting with and stuff. So yeah, it's cool.
Nice. Yeah. Look, I think that is maybe one of the more challenging questions to answer, because I think that is a question which has been facing society in less than obvious ways for the longest time. But it's essentially like the trope of the devouring mother. That's sort of like the term. It's sort of like a person that creates safety is always vulnerable to becoming coddling. Maybe is a more modern term for the idea. And that is the case because it is extremely difficult to both be the person that is pushing you to achieve more as well as the person protecting you from risk and danger. And so it's essentially like one of the sort of, you know, iconic fairy tale narratives that people develop stories around, just because it is so difficult.
Well, and that's interesting that you say that, because I don't feel like I am protecting anyone from risk and danger. Like, I don't feel like that's in my job description to protect other people from risk and danger. I think that it's my job to prepare people to protect each other from risk and danger. Like, I know that that's like very pedantic, but like, I feel like there is a distinction there that's very much related to mothering. Like, you can mother somebody to become a good mother, but you can mother somebody to not become a good mother. And I think like, yeah, like passing on the ability to make other people safe, like that's more interesting to me. Like, I'll give you an example. We had a meeting recently where the discussion leader was absent and members of the community stepped up. And I feel like that to me is a good example of how like, I'm not protecting them. I'm not there to like protect them from the discomfort of that person not showing up, and you have 11 people on a Zoom call being like, who's supposed to lead this? Who's supposed to lead this? Like, but because of the way that they've been prepared as a group, they were able to self-organize, and like one of them grabbed the rules and put them in the chat and then started reading them aloud. Another person like started offering to take notes. The third person was like, oh, I'll manage the speaking queue, like, and offered an icebreaker. Like, I feel like that idea that I didn't need to be there to protect them because I had helped them to protect each other and themselves. I think that's, yeah, I feel like that was, it's one of my proudest accomplishments of the month, honestly. It's the way that could have been very bad meeting. Like, that could have been really bad. Like, we've had meetings in the past where, you know, someone couldn't make it and it was like, well, should we keep going? Should we even, I'll see you next month. And that was at the very beginning when people had like less of a feel. But now it's like, Yeah, and it was the people that have been here the longest that stepped up. Like there was one person I felt there was like their first meeting, and this is like the first experience they have in this club. I'm like, oh, that could have gone so very badly, and it ended up being a really fantastic meeting from what I could tell. Like people really enjoyed it, and they went really deep, and it didn't seem any different. So, yeah. All right, you want to hear my last question for you? So I was thinking about our early peership and how unsafe I personally felt in some of the earliest tough, deep chats that we had. They triggered a pattern of me thinking that a relationship was lessened through conflict or disagreement. And I specifically remember how thoughtful you were to remind me that we were still good, even when things got hard. Like I remember that you used to write me emails, like anticipating that I might be feeling some sort of way about like rejection sensitivity, about something that was said or whatever. And I like really appreciated that so much. Like that's something that I've started doing for other friends because you did that for me. So thank you. And also if anybody's listening to this, please know that that is like so appreciated by so many people. So just like a quick note of like, hey, that got hard. That was weird. We're still cool. Like I'm excited to continue this chat another time. Like that means a lot. So my question about that is, what role does safety play in your relationships? And do you find that creating a sense of safety for yourself and others enhances your connections? Or do you think it can sometimes prevent authentic expression or conflict that might lead to growth?
I would say the quote unquote real version of safety, and I'm saying that somewhat tongue in cheek, but the distinction between like the sort of veneer of safety and its reality is in understanding that the walls need to be able to be broadened. And what I mean by that is if we take the example that you sort of laid out, is like before we had that those kinds of conversations, it wasn't clear whether they were sitting within the walls of safety or outside of the walls of safety. And I think what true safety is, especially when it comes into relationships, is being able to step outside of the walls, notice the fact that you are in undiscovered territory, and know that you're not going to be locked outside, you know? And I think there's a friend of mine who I kind of need to do a little bit of a tip of the hat to, because that isn't something that comes naturally to me. I had a very good friend, I'll maybe just give her first name. Her name's Nicola, who I knew in went to primary school together, but I knew her mostly in university. And it was the first time I think that I developed a strong friendship with a person who suffered from anxiety. And I think it was in kind of getting to know her and getting to know her well, but both the version of her that sort of shows up in public and in social environments, as well as the one that kind of deals with the aftermath, that I realized, like, often people can smile and wave and say goodbye and act like everything is okay, and then kind of like, go through the most after that. And especially because that doesn't happen to me, I kind of assumed that when a person smiles, waves, and says goodbye, it's because they're happy with the way things ended, because that has been my experience of reality. And so in kind of learning that that is not the case for everyone, I think I realized that there is a benefit in consistently pointing out where exactly the walls of what is safe and what isn't are, especially when you have engaged in unknown territory or previously unexperienced territory. And so I would say, in some sense, the role that safety plays in that is like, there is a part of conflict that grows us, but it only grows us if we can step back into a place where we feel safe. If you go out into that place of safety, out of the context of safety, and you were challenged, and you come back and the safe spaces have suddenly vanished, it's like you're not growing from that. You're now in survival mode because you need to build new walls and like protect yourself from all of the things that previously were predictable. because now everything's sort of up in the air. And I mean, in the context of the discussion, like I can see a world in which, we kind of have a conversation like that. And then I'm like, hey, like we have a challenging conversation like that. And then the email that you receive is like, hey, I didn't like how you treated me. I don't want to chat with you again. It's like, that's not safety. Like, and I think there are many places that parade the safety flag around, but as soon as somebody crosses the line, they're sort of like excommunicated. And then my question is like, that doesn't sound like a safe space, because you're not safe enough to fail or make a mistake or cross a line which was unintentionally or unknowingly crossed. And so I think safety is required in order to make risk beneficial.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely say that I would not have been able to get to the level of friendship that we have without that early work of comfort and safety being done, because I've since then, not only do I provide that for friends that I know also deal with anxiety, but I also disclose my rejection sensitivity to new people in my life as well. Like I'll tell them, hey, like I have a weird thing where like I will have a perfectly fine time with you and then I'm going to convince myself that you hate me. So just if that happens, I need some reassurance, especially in new relationships. And that's like a thing with me. And that's a really hard thing to tell people. Like it's not a first encounter conversation, but as I get closer with people and I have more deep and consistent one-on-one interaction with them, where we're actually like getting into depth, I do have a tendency to tell people that, especially if things get hard, which I learned that about myself through you doing that. Like, so yeah. So thank you, Nicola, for what it's worth. Yeah.
Yep.
I love when our friends leave us better than when they found us, and that's an awesome example. And you're an awesome example of having pushed it forward. So yeah, it's awesome.
That is the sign of a true friendship. One of the things which we've, when we initially started this conversation off air between the two of us, it kind of initially started as we're kind of in these two camps and we're trying to find a middle ground. But I think what this conversation has essentially reinforced is the fact that risk and safety are not two camps. They are in some sense a yin and a yang, and they are both required in order to make in order to actually enable both growth, but also, strong and meaningful relationships. And I think it's clear from pretty much, I think from the very first question all the way until now, that these two sort of states of being are both required in order to live like a fulfilling and meaningful life.
Yeah, I agree. So we did the one thing that we prepared to share here, as opposed to the questions being totally off the cuff, is Alfi and I went through and created a list of like what we think contextually makes danger or risk and safety helpful or harmful. So we have like a tight little bulleted list that we can go through. Do you want to start with helpful? Like, cool. Let's talk about safety. Like, in what context is safety helpful?
Yeah, I think this one was good for me to sort of talk about, because I think I can sometimes take safety for granted. But especially when you are hurt or a wound is still open. And I think we touched on that briefly in our conversation. When you're in the process of building boundaries, which, this last sort of bit that you spoke about, in terms of that email is a great example of that. And then when you've spent all of your energy and kind of need to recuperate a little bit, that's really when safety comes in, both in handy for the person who sort of needs it, as well as for the people around them.
You're good. And then I'll take the context that risk is helpful, since similarly, I needed to think about the other side. Going into this, I was like, what? Risk? Helpful? Meh. So a context that it's helpful is when you're feeling some sort of stagnancy, like when you're feeling that everything is kind of like meh, the same all the time. We also talked about it being like an echo chamber, like when things feel like they're kind of like just reverberating off of you and coming back to you, like you're huffing your own gases, that kind of a feeling. We also talked about that risk is helpful when an old memory is what's bringing fear. Like it's like when you're anxious about something and you're not actually dealing with the thing. It's like in the past. That feels like a time when taking some form of risk to move forward. We talked specifically about like immersion therapy and whether or not like that level of risk makes sense. And it's like, well, if the person is motivated intrinsically to solve that thing, yes. But if not, that could be really harmful. And so I think that's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And then on the other side of things, there's now the question, when is safety harmful? Which is, not always the most obvious thing, but especially when it removes beneficial consequences. And I think that's a big one for me because it's something that I've experienced at multiple different times, my own experience. But then I think another one is when short term, like when we're choosing safety in service of the short term, but at the expense of short term either comfort at the expense of long term growth. That's another situation in which it can be harmful. When it is protecting you from what you fear rather than real danger. And when it is hiding a necessary truth.
Yep. And then when risk is harmful is when you're already triggered, like you've already hit the fight or flight response. There's no coming through to you at that point. It's just harm. When boundaries have already been challenged, like if you're already over the line, and then when it is involuntarily introduced. So no one wants to have risk thrown on them, but taking risk yourself on purpose through the lens of growth can be very, very impactful in a positive way. Whew, that's quite a list, Alfi. I'm proud of us. I felt like 2 or 3 weeks ago, we decided to do this topic and we were like, gosh, this is so mushy and so hard to talk about. And like, we couldn't even agree on what the definition of risk was or what the opposite was or anything. And I feel really proud of us for tackling this. I feel like I learned a lot through this conversation. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think I also got to learn a little bit more about you, which has been cool.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah. And I think, this has definitely been an eye-opening conversation. And I think you are right. Our longest one so far. And so I think it is a good time for us to transition into our age-old question. Abby, how made sense of are you this month?
I was like, I'm going to have an answer right away to just to confirm that this is not a pattern that we're creating every single episode where I don't know the answer to the question I know is coming the whole time. But no, I don't know the answer to the question that's coming the whole time. I'm trying to figure out if I'm still in the parking lot, like the metaphorical parking lot at the metaphorical train station with the metaphorical burnout train leaving the station without me in it. I kind of feel like I did leave the station parking lot. Yeah. But I think I'm like at the first light. You know what I mean? Like I could turn around. I'm not home yet. I could turn around. I could still turn around. I could still decide it's easier to live at the train station. But no, I kind of feel like I'm on my way home. Like I feel like Make Sense-Miss is, I'm the proudest that I've ever been of the content that we're putting out this year and of the stories that we're telling. I feel like I'm seeing a lot of evidence of hope in terms of this club really being the community that I imagined it as. I really think it's like becoming that. And then, I feel like the inevitable, like, oh my gosh, I'm almost done with all the things I said I was going to do for the year. Like Make Sense-Miss is a big one. So I feel like there's like a I'm very busy, but I don't feel burnt out. And I think I'm taking care of myself, but I'm also fairly sure I'm going to collapse the week of the election. So, yeah, I don't know. How are you? How made sense of are you this month, Alfie?
I feel pretty made sense of in a strange way. I think especially because I've kind of been sort of back in familiar ground. I'm doing a little bit of contract design work. And so I've kind of gone back into old tools and old, activities that feel a little bit more familiar, which has been it has been interesting watching myself experience that, and kind of like step a little bit away from consistently challenging myself to do new things, to kind of going back and doing an old thing that I haven't done for a while. So that I think has been pretty eye-opening. But then over and above that, talking in a little bit more of a general sense, I think there has also been a little bit of an existential air to the previous, 2 or 3 conversations that we've had, which kind of seems to have dissipated a little bit. Maybe it's because we're sort of reaching the end of the month. The end of the year. Maybe it might also be because there are not as many big questions hanging over my head right now. Or at least not ones that I have to answer immediately. And I also had to finally do my tax. So that's also not hanging over my head anymore, which is great.
Congratulations. Big adulting over there. Big adult.
Yeah. It's hilarious how every year that is like a thing that hangs over my head for like a couple. Like I always tell myself I'm just gonna get it out of the way, and I always like only do it like within 2 or 3 days of the cutoff time.
You'll have taxes due in October? That's so interesting. Ours are due in April. Weird.
No, it's October.
No idea why.
The side. But yeah, so that's where I am. Feels good to not always be asking existential questions.
Agreed. We're asking very tactical questions right now, which is good. Yeah. Should we tell them a little bit about where we're at with our course? Because I feel like there's quite a few people on the waiting list now. Like I feel a mounting sense of pressure because every week we seem to have new people that have joined the waiting list. So if you're on the waiting list, know that the reason it's taking us so long is because we want to be able to deal with the volume of the waiting list. Like if we were to open up to our waiting list right now with the course we originally designed, we would only be able to take like 15 people. And we really don't want to do that. So we are designing a better mousetrap, I would say, for this thing. And yeah, I hope that everyone is feeling excited and hopeful for 2025 because we are.
Yeah, and maybe on that, the one aspect of it that I would just like, something that has been surprising, although I don't know if I should entirely be surprised, but I would say the quality is remarkably better. Like I am seeing a lot more. I am using the tools as I'm building them for my own well-being, you might say.
Good.
So like I'm really keen to get to see how other people react to some of these aspects. Just because I think it's helping me in my own life.
Yeah, I mean, we were very honest with our early students that like this is very much a work in progress. But I feel like as we're getting ready for this next version to launch, I definitely feel similarly. Like I feel like we are actually putting a point on the thing and saying like we're confident in this thing, which is cool. So yeah, definitely. It's been fun also just like digging in so much with you the last couple of months, like really getting back to work instead of just talking about it. Because for a while we just had to figure out what the hell to do. Because everybody wants this thing that's awesome, but there's only so much of our lifetime. So, all right.
Yeah, but so maybe before we do wrap up, it'd be good to hear a little bit from you how some of the other aspects are going behind the scenes for the club. What's been the latest and how's it been going?
Yeah, it's been a really exciting month. We had some special events come up this month. So we had one about ethical management, another about burnout. Make Sensemas obviously has been like a big focus for our club and kind of getting excited for that. But I feel like the thing that I've noticed about the club this last month is people really digging into mutual aid. Like it feels like more and more people are creating these like small little moments together where they're asking for assistance from one another and they're actually receiving that assistance and then they're paying that forward. And so, yeah, I'm feeling like people are starting to understand what each other's strengths are and they're starting to go to those people for those strengths. And that's been really hopeful to see. And then I think I already mentioned that we have some flex sessions that have just launched. So now members can kind of book their own thing. So this month has been exciting because it's like getting everybody to dive in and actually do that. So yeah, I'm very proud of the people that are willing to be brave because the thing is new. And yeah, so overall, I think everything is really, I feel like I don't know what I wanted it to be by now, but it's very different than what I could have imagined it as. Like in some ways, tactically, it's exactly what I designed, but the impact of it, I don't think that I could see before. And now that I'm seeing it, I'm really tickled about it. Like, I think when I started it was kind of like, wouldn't it be cool if we could all just like hang out because we're nerdy and like we have like minds and like we could talk about these nerdy things. But what I'm realizing now is like community is such an important solve for loneliness. Like there's so many lonely people right now that are surrounded by people all day long. It's not like they're by themselves necessarily, but that depth of conversation is what's been missing. That like that being seen part is what's missing. And so, yeah, I think this month I've just seen a whole lot of people seeing one another. And that's been really cool. All right, well, now I feel like it's our 7th episode. We've run very over time. God bless Kevin for making this any shorter than the original Raw, which is very long. Oh, I did want to say we did have one person reach out to ask for the list of 42. So, for what it's worth. One person. So thank you to your one person. It was very exciting to get that email. And yeah, I really appreciated that. So yeah, if you're listening to this, if you're enjoying these conversations, hit all the buttons, tell your friends, tell us that you're listening because we have no idea if anyone is. This is mostly a personal project for Alfi and I to explore these topics together. But obviously, if it's helping other people, we want to know about it. So yeah. And with that, until next time, be clear.